Rhode Island was the final state to ratify the Constitution. The proceedings of the Rhode Island Convention were not published in Eliot's debates, but were published since by the Rhode Island Historical Society. These quotes come from that book. The debates in Rhode Island centered upon two contentious issues: the role of the government in religion and how far the state of Rhode Island was willing to go to be complicit in the institution of slavery.
It is singular that a gentleman who has advocated that no powers of Congress ought to have been given more than were allowed by the old Congress. That the old Congress had no power to interfere with slavery in the states. By this Constitution the Congress may abolish that slave trade in 20 years. This is a valuable acquisition.
Benjamin Bourne here is comparing this proposed government to the government under the Articles of Confederation. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no right to interfere with the slave trade at all. That was an entirely state matter. Whereas in the Constitution, Congress may outlaw it in 1808. And that's not nothing, according to Bourne.
I wish all men would agree not to establish any religion. It is enough for us to keep it out of the general government.
Because of the religious history of Rhode Island and Rhode Island's religious difficulties with their neighbors in Massachusetts, Rhode Island has a tradition of being non-denominational in terms of government. Here, Merchant is acknowledging that a state could outlaw a church or establish one as it wished, but he was happy to see the federal government could not do it.
On an amendment outlawing the transatlantic slave trade. It rests on this whether we value the representation of the blacks in the southern states of more consequence than the liberty of ourselves. We had better let the southern states trade to Africa than to expose our own liberty. We ought to take care at home before we look abroad.
Jonathan Hazard here is speaking of an amendment to outlaw the slave trade. He doesn't like the fact that slaves are represented in the formula which calculates the number of representatives each state is entitled to, but he accepts the compromise so that we don't endanger our own liberty.
2d. That all power is naturally vested in, and consequently derived from the people. That magistrates therefore are their trustees and agents, and at all times amenable to them. 3d. That the powers of government may be reassumed by the people, whensoever it shall become necessary to their happiness. That the rights of the states respectively, to nominate and appoint all state officers, and every other power, jurisdiction and right, which is not by the said Constitution clearly delegated to the Congress of the United States or to the departments of government thereof, remain to the people of the several states, or their respective state governments, to whom they may have granted the same. And that those clauses in the said Constitution, which declare that Congress shall not have or exercise certain powers, do not imply that Congress is entitled to any powers not given by the said Constitution, but such clauses are to be construed as exceptions to certain specified powers, or as inserted merely for greater caution.
Late in the process, the Rhode Island Convention adopted a Declaration of Rights. These provisions are pretty much anti-federalist boilerplate, many of them originally drafted by George Mason of Virginia. But some of the points are worth going over. The people hold the power and elected officials are their trustees and agents. Okay, so far so good. When the people feel that a new government is necessary for their happiness, now this is different from Virginia. Virginia said, if the powers delegated are perverted or injury and oppression, Rhode Island declared that they can resume powers delegated to the federal government whenever it's necessary to their happiness. So if they just don't like something, they can do it. Any clause, like Article 1, Section 9, which specifically outlaws federal activity, does not mean the federal government has additional powers that are not enumerated.
Fourth, that religion, or the duty which we owe to our Creator, and the manner of discharging it, can be directed only by reason and conviction, and not by force or violence, and therefore all men have an equal, natural and unalienable right to the free exercise of religion, according to the dictates of conscience, and that no particular religious sect or society ought to be favored or established by law in preference to others. 17th. That the people have a right to keep and bear arms. That a well-regulated militia, including the body of the people capable of bearing arms, is the proper, natural and safe defense of a free state.
Rhode Island also adopted George Mason's formula for religious liberty. No particular religious sect ought to be favored or established by law. Finally, Rhode Island shows the relationship between the body of the people and the right to keep and bear arms. The founders believed that a standing army was dangerous to liberty, and they wanted to defend themselves using the militia, i.e. the body of the people capable of bearing arms, and this was the natural defense of a free state.
First, the United States shall guarantee to each state its sovereignty, freedom, and independence, and every power, jurisdiction and right which is not by this Constitution expressly delegated to the United States. 17th. As a traffic tending to establish or continue the slavery of any part of the human species is disgraceful to the cause of liberty and humanity, that Congress shall, as soon as may be, promote and establish such laws and regulations as may effectually prevent the importation of slaves of every description into the United States. 18th. That the state legislatures have power to recall, when they think it expedient, their federal senators, and to send others in their stead. 19th. That Congress have power to establish a uniform rule of inhabitancy, or settlement of the poor of the different states throughout the United States. 20th. That Congress erect no company with exclusive advantages of commerce.
Finally, Rhode Island adopted some recommended constitutional amendments. First, each state retains its sovereignty and every power that is not expressly delegated to the U.S. Next, the slave trade is a disgrace and Congress should outlaw it now. Next, state legislatures may recall their senators. Remember, at this time, senators were like ambassadors from independent countries, coming together to form the Senate. Most were appointed by their state legislature. So here, Rhode Island is just saying, we appoint them, we should also be able to recall them. And Rhode Island suggested that the national government should establish a uniform role of inhabitants or residents for the poor, which is an unusual stipulation. No one else came up with that one. And finally, Rhode Island says Congress can't favor one company over another. They knew that if the federal government could do this, that it would become a political football and other people would want their slice of the pie. So Rhode Island decided, let's keep this off the plate for the federal government. Again, advocates of ratification assured their skeptical peers that the federal government could only exercise powers expressly delegated to it. New Hampshire wanted it on the record that all powers, quote, not expressly and particularly delegated, unquote, are reserved. The other amendments addressed standing armies, armed citizens, and religious freedom. The ratification of Rhode Island meant that all of the states that had declared independence in July 1776 had now joined the new union under the Constitution. With the last four, the votes were pretty close, and advocates had to work to convince their skeptical compatriots that it was okay to ratify this Constitution. They did this by assuring them that the federal government would only be allowed to exercise the powers that were expressly delegated to it. The federal government cannot use vague powers or find powers within penumbras and emanations of the other federal powers. It has to be there in black and white. If it's not there in black and white, it is not a legitimate federal power, according to the founders. And that is what made this Constitution safe to ratify.